that you've been exploring Dharma contemplation practice, because it's near and dear to my heart. And there's not that many Dharma contemplation groups in the world. So in the sense of keeping the practice alive, exploring it further, like what is this, and finding your own way. It's brilliant the way each of you takes turns facilitating it. It's just perfect. And so I'm just really happy to be here. That's all. And I received a number of sort of questions or requests or something by way of lieu that some of you had offered as to the things that you'd like me to speak about. And I kind of have condensed them into what I hope is a coherent collection of a little bit about the history of Dharma contemplation, but really at the core, what is the purpose of it? And from that basis, a close look at the phases and we will touch those not just conceptually, but at each phase, I want to stop and give us some time to sense into it experientially. And then that will open us up into some of the other questions about how it relates to insight dialogue and to the whole life path and that kind of thing. So that's the general scope of what I hope to do. And then to open it up to all of us for conversation, questions, that kind of thing. So at the core of Dharma contemplation is, why do we do it? What's the purpose? And it's really to absorb Dhamma wisdom. Simply, that's it. There's a lot of, variations we can talk about, but when we touch the teachings, do they get in? And so the practice is designed to let those teachings in as deeply, as intimately as possible. And the way we do it is with an immersive intimacy with a text. And that immersive part is, of course, that for the period of time of our practice, that's all we're doing, So it's it's intentional, and there's a method, you might say, to the intimacy. And that is to, first of all, engage the power of spiritual friendship, where it's perfectly possible to practice Dharma contemplation on your own. Even when you practice on your own, you're taking the Buddha as a spiritual friend. I mean, he's provided this guidance. It happens to have been a very long time ago, but to the, as much as possible, we're recognizing and touching the continuity of a thread that has been handed down from teacher to student to people who wouldn't call themselves teachers or students, but are just moved by the Dhamma. But that, in a sense, right, makes them part of that lineage, which is part of a connection with the Buddha as a spiritual friend, as a teacher. So the groundedness in spiritual friendship, both in that long historical sense, part of a lineage, and it doesn't have to just be early Buddhist lineage, but that's where we usually draw our text from, not exclusively. But also the spiritual friends like here on this screen, like us, being in it together is also part of the power of the practice. And we'll talk about that as we go. And there's a phases, as you know, in Dharma contemplation practice. It begins with preparation. So, before we even sit down, perhaps we have a sense of what the practice is or its purpose, but really our inner motivation. It can be very helpful to be conscious of where's my heart aimed, where am I going? Because it makes us perhaps softer, more available, so that the teachings can land and the roots can set down in us. And then each of the 5 phases moves through the body-mind and accesses different capacities. And of course, we'll talk about those. But remember, this is all in service of this one very simple, profound purpose, which is to absorb Dhamma wisdom. Right? So it's all ways to absorb Dhamma wisdom. And there's a rigor to it, a definiteness. You might call it a technique with purpose and intention. And the rigor, where each phase we do our best to really stay with just that, despite the mind want to run to other places. And that can feel for some constraining. Oh, I really love thinking about the Dhamma. I want to stay with that phase, or I want to get to it quickly. Or I love the feeling part, or I love the intuitive or the essence aspect. But if we give ourselves over to each phase and just commit, sort of like, I'm in, that's it. For now, right now, this is it. That within that, then there is a tremendous freedom. We don't have to worry or think about all these other possible approaches, so we can discover that part of our capacity rather than go to where it's easy or where it's just attractive. You see what I'm saying? It kind of guides us and thereby deepens us. So these phases evolved over time. There were originally 4, and they originally were very close to the phases that you find in the Christian practice of Lectio Divina. There's some variation from Lectio Divina of method and some difference of intention, but what it shares is this kind of living immersion in a text, where the text comes alive inside of us, you might say. So in the case of Lectio Divina, it's you might say it's living the words of God, but it's much more personalized around living the words of Jesus and living into the Jesus experience. The phases of Dharma contemplation were conceived from the beginning as primarily a group practice. However, the source, if you will, of inspiration was how I myself approached reading Dhamma. And so in that sense, I was drawing on individual experience because I wasn't usually reading Dhamma with other people. So when we move through each phase, which we'll do in just a moment, understand that the practice evolved and had shall we say, difficulties. That's what would make me change the practice. So, for example, I'll start with a place where there was a difficulties, but I didn't change the practice. I think that would be an interesting place to begin, which is this very first phase of the words, where we're reading through the text and just speaking the words that touch us for we don't even know why, and we just speak that word or maybe a couple of words in a phrase, And, that's a weird thing to do. I mean, it's a strange feeling to do that. And so for quite a while, I felt intuitively like this is the right thing, but I knew how it was weird, and people would tell me how when they practiced it, it was weird. And yet I could see it functioning. I could see it doing what I'd hoped it would do, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the point is, I stayed with it. And now I feel this it's had some time, this practice has been around for, I don't know how long now, 15 years or something. And I've learned, and perhaps you have and others have, there's a certain poetry in it, a certain playfulness, there's a certain the way that you meet the text through just words, like disembodied, it's got a whole other, I don't want to say power, flavor that it brings to the entry into what then can get very, shall we say, deep, But an example of where I saw problems and hung on and then said, no, this isn't working, has a lot to do with the best example, I should say, is the meaning phase, where the intellect is invited in. It's a reflection of our culture that this phase gathers so much energy for people, and they dive in and they say, oh, this I know how to do, and like you talk about the text and you talk about anything that connected with it. We'll talk about this in a moment, but like the cultural situation or the language itself or structure or anything like that, it's great, it's beautiful. But what happens, I saw, is that people, it came in like pounding you after just delicately touching meanings. And it's like, feelings, it's like, whoa, that's intense, and that's kind of, but just as bad was what it did on the other side, which is people couldn't let go of it to go into the dialogue and just sense the felt experience of their own lives that were back up in the intellectual processing head. And so I said, oh my God. And I swapped the emotion and the meaning phases, and I swapped them back. And this went on for years. It was very challenging. And so later, when we got to this awkward thing of going into dialogue, but it had been conditioned by the conceptual thinking mind. But if I put it earlier, then people didn't drop into the feeling tone of the words enough, right? You see the problem? That fit perfectly with what was ready to happen when I actually went to Sri Lanka. And I went there to for a temporary ordination. So I was wearing robes. And the monk who was, he wasn't my preceptor, but he was my host. And he's a very, very smart man. And I think he had a lot of wisdom too. I didn't know him extremely well. He was the teacher of one of my Insight Dialogue teacher students. And I told him about Dharma contemplation, and I connected it with some of the suttas, some of the exploration of how the Buddha speaks about different ways of learning. Perhaps you've heard of Sutta Maya and Chinta Maya and Bhavana Maya, these different ways of learning. And he said, oh, well, what you're doing is very much like this ancient Sri Lankan system. And he named the phases in this system. It didn't look like Dharma contemplation, but it was a sort of a stepped immersion in one's learning process. And I don't know exactly what the content of that, how they conveyed the content. But the point is that there was a phase, and since I would have to go through all my notes to find the Pali for you, I haven't done that, honestly. That I said, this is it. This is the missing piece. And that's where the essence phase came from. And now you see the essence phase comes after meaning, but before dialogue. So you can do the emotion first and then the meaning. And then rather than launch into the dialogue from the conceptual, you're now to drop and stand at the boundary between the conceptual meaning and this wordless essence. So it's a tall order. It still asks a lot of us as Dhamma practitioners. But if we follow that, then the power of the whole practice can move through that essence into the present moment experience of the dialogue phase. And that's where the practice kind of settled. This was 2013. It was when I ordained. So I came back and continued that work. So it's been about 8 years in its current form. So let's talk about that form now that you know it just comes from human experimentation. It doesn't come from a God. So I was just trying to point to the kind of the human process of developing it, which I hope is reflected in the humanity of your experience of it. Maybe that's where I'm going, So the first, you might say, phase of practice isn't one of the formal 5 phases. It's really the silence that we start with. And the silence clears the field, clears our own field. It lets the body-mind settle. And it sets a kind of a entry, doorway, a boundary where we know we're going into something beautiful or special or worthy of our attention. And so during the silence, we're setting an intention. We're aiming our hearts in the direction of the Dhamma and preparing to let it inform us, and really more than not just inform us in the thinking mind, but to take us, to discover us as much as we discover it. And in that, there's a humility. It's like, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know so much. I'm not an expert at anything. Are there some words here that might enter me? I hope so. Something like that. And I want to learn. I feel receptive. So that's the feeling that opens up in the silence. So that we can experience this preparatory phase, I'd like to give us a few minutes of silence. And perhaps you could sense into your experience right now of availability to experience, to life, to the Dhamma that I'm sharing, or to your spiritual friendships here. And noticing what silence can bring to that. So you might notice how the silence prepares the mind, how it settles the mind, creates space. when a Dharma contemplation group meets, usually the silence is followed by the reading of the text into the silence. And the text, we have this sense of transmission, across a couple of thousand years of historical time, a sense of the voice of the Buddha touching. And from the beginning, I've always tried to have the voice of a male and a female Buddha. Questions of gender as a binary thing were not so much being asked then. People were experiencing it, but it wasn't being asked. But the intention is to have a sense of human inclusion in any event. And so across the silence that has prepared the heart, prepared the mind, the words come in, and we're hearing the text. Let me change that. The text carries something, carries the Dhamma, and we're hearing the Dhamma the way it was originally experienced. Because remember, the experience of the monks, the nuns, the lay people of the time of the Buddha, this is how they heard the Dhamma. They didn't read the Dhamma. And they didn't hear it from other teachers. They heard it from the Buddha, which is pretty remarkable. And so that's the experience that we're drawing on, or that we're emulating, or that we're making possible as much as we can. And so this first phase then, when we hear the words spoken, and then we open our eyes if they've been closed and we pick up our text, now there's this, so you might say, the beginning of a personal experience with the text, but it's a shared experience at the same time. It's an interesting dynamic that is easy to forget how those layers are both operating. The support that we have, the different perspectives, the different words, you will notice as you go through the text over and over, reading it over and over, and you speak individual words, you will say different words than I would say. And it draws my attention. It gets into me in a way that if I'm just doing this phase by myself, I'll definitely be functioning from the blindness that I bring to it, from my own conditioning. So already we have this beautiful advantage of working together, and yet it's this very personal, intimate experience of, I'm reading the text and there's reading and words and it's happening in my mind kind of thing, and yet it's not, right? It's quite a lovely, alive, kind of mysterious thing that's happening here. And this first phase is intended to introduce us to the text in this very bare way. We don't have to be smart. We don't have to have a lot of feeling. We don't have to have anything. It's just find the words. Let the words begin to enter your life, just that much. But a lot happens when we do that. One of the things that's happening is just by what words we choose to speak, there's a relationship with them that we're forming. And as I said, when someone else speaks a word, say, oh, I didn't even notice the word thus, or, or bhikkhus, or something that we would have been like on all the really heavy content words. Someone else is noticing something. I don't know what or why. And takes us out of our bubble. And what's beginning to happen is that we're in the early phases by being introduced to the text. Whether we know it or not, we're beginning to memorize it. There is a timeless tradition of memorizing texts in all spiritual traditions. It's very, very strong in Buddhism. And largely that's done with the support of chanting. And it's done largely in group practice. And this is how the teachings have been carried for all this time. It's we forget, with our books and our, modern things that we have, it's quite different. But without that, without the chanting, they didn't have a way of maintaining those texts. So this is our humble beginning into that, just touched by the words. So the words come in, and already now the mind is beginning to, in being familiar, we're beginning to memorize them. We don't do a lot of that. So this is a wonderful addition to our Buddhist menu, our Buddhist lives, that the text now, maybe you have noticed this, that if you've done some Dharma contemplation, that what happens when you get familiar with and memorize a text, it's available to you other times. It's like the teachings become part of your life. You're out there, taking out the garbage, and something can pop in because it's there now, So this is all the experience of many people doing this at once is kind of like a haiku. You're getting words coming that are very, don't have anything around them. And so there's a poetry of bareness, of simplicity, which I personally find to be surprising and strangely beautiful. And it prepares us for our next phase, which is the feeling responses, right? So now, even though we didn't name it yet, there's some reason that a certain word popped out at us and we decided to speak it. Maybe it agitated us, or we found it interesting and strange, and so we speak it. Now, we're actually specifically in this felt responses phase, we're specifically attuning to the felt responses of the body. And as others speak a word and then say what that felt response is, or as we speak a word and say, like when I read this word, I feel this, that we're paying attention to not our conceptual response to the word, not to the meaning of the sutta, but we're continuing this process of intimacy with the text. And so we might touch those subtle resonances that are always happening. Like even now as I'm speaking, there's resonances that are happening in your mind and your heart that we might miss otherwise. And so in a way you might say, we're touching or attuning to our humanity, our human response to this Dhamma text. And importantly, we're tuning and receiving the human response of our spiritual friends in the group, our co-practitioners. So once again, so you may say something like, when I read the word impermanence, I don't feel so steady on my feet anymore. And perhaps we gain some little doorway into anicca, into impermanence that touches us, that awakens us, or that prepares us for the next phases and so on. We're getting closer, more intimate with the words. The words are carrying through their signs and symbols and meanings something essential about the Dhamma. So it's our doorway, that feeling response, and we're gaining it from others as well as from ourselves. So I'm going to invite us into you might say, a moment of practice with that individually now, just because of time, actually. And I'm going to just say 3 different words, and I'm going to let you ruminate, ponder those 3 words in silence, and just notice if you can feel any resonances, okay? So I'll say them several times in the silence to rejuvenate, okay? So first, just setting the sense of being here in quiet together. And the first word is sensitivity. Sensitivity. How it's experienced in the body, the mind. Sensitivity. Intimacy. Intimacy. Friendship. Friendship. Again, sensitivity. Intimacy. Friendship. And perhaps from this we gain just a renewal of our sense of subtle responses to words. And of course, when the words are intended to carry liberating wisdom, we need this this kind of human touch, this responsiveness to allow the letting go, the freedom that they speak about, the compassion they speak about. And so now in this kind of delicate touch, you can see the challenge of the next phase, which is meaning. Because now we invite the power of the rational thinking mind, of the intellect. And I always think of it as, the phrase, at least in English, playing with fire. Because our culture is so strong in this area and has valued it as the place of meaning, of purpose, understanding comes through the thinking mind. But rather than saying, no, that's not true, we say, yes, it's true, and it comes from other places. So we don't throw it out now. We respect it, we appreciate it, and we let it do its work. And what's very important here is that there's an attempt at objectivity, which is not possible, but there's a cultural objectivity that we can allow in to challenge our Buddhist culture, just the way we would hope that any powerful force in our lives could be questioned. Like religion, as a powerful force in society, can do a lot of good in strengthening morality and love. But unquestioned, it becomes an avenue for hatred, for killing, for separation, terrible things. But if it's questioned, if we allow the questions in, then we can scrape away what's harmful, preconceptions that bind us in what we think Buddhism is, and go to depths or to new understandings of what's being offered here, because we can use different intellectual lenses. See, there's great power here in that. There's another power hidden in language, words, concept, and that is its ability to point beyond itself. So if we begin to, let's say, question a word and don't mind using the intellect, as some of you may know from philosophy, from postmodernism, this kind of thing, you go deeply into language and behind it you find nothing. That's a kind of a constructionist, post-constructionist, modernist, postmodernist, all this stuff. But the point is that it allows us to come to a new relationship with words, where we can absorb the power, but not be in a trance of concept, of conceiving. So even my speaking now is using words to point beyond the conceiving mind. Do you see that? Right now I'm doing that. Because I'm saying, look at how we're communicating by words. I speak, you hear these words, you understand intellectually, but then you say, we're pointing to something on the other side of that, like where the words disappear, but words are talking about words disappearing. Right? So we do the same thing with like Buddhist culture. This is where we get a chance to question, wait a minute, there's misogyny here. Wait a minute. This is Iron Age India. I live in the age of the internet in, let's say, Europe or North America. And really ask those questions that in some cases there's no space for. This is the space for it. Nothing is off limits. Of course, it's all done with, and this is the challenge, it's all done with the basis of meditative practice. So what happens, this is where it's playing with fire, is the conceiving mind starts revving up and getting into its own world. And it speeds up, it gets gross, it gets unsubtle. And then, of course, it's just playing with itself. It doesn't go beyond itself. So it's a very great challenge here, but a great opportunity. Is this making sense? I hope so, because this is a really helpful thing in this practice. So we come with a recognition of the limitations of language, and at the same time know that analysis and concept can go further than we usually take it, and it can even leave itself behind. So just taking a moment now, I'll ask a question, and I want to invite you to use your thinking mind to reflect on this question and notice how you're thinking. Notice how the mind is conceiving, but it's aware that it's conceiving. Okay, so you're not trapped by it. There's sati is operating with it. Okay? So here's a question. Again, remember your assignment to watch the mind work with concept, to keep the sati and allow the conceiving mind to function. So, as you pause, what Buddhist knowledge is useful? The Four Noble Truths, is it useful? The Eightfold Path, concept, it's a concept, is it useful? Cause and effect, karma. The power of friendship and compassion, is that a useful concept? What Buddhist knowledge is useful? So as you do this, perhaps you experience, as I did, what does useful even mean? I mean, what is it, what is the Four Noble Truths or the Noble Eightfold Path? how can that conceptual framework actually touch my life? And you see that there's doorways that have nothing to do directly with language, but they're conveyed by language. So those pathways bring us closer to this next phase, which is the essence phase. So this is the most sensitive phase of Dharma contemplation practice. It challenges us to release the grasp of conceptual thinking and yet not leave the Dhamma behind. Very, very delicate experience. And there's a threshold where we stand like on a precipice, and we've been walking along with the support of the text and the Dhamma and words and trying to feel into those words and what's beneath them. And we come to the edge of the words, into the vastness. And yet, in order to speak to our spiritual friends in practice, what is essential in this text, in this teaching, we have to touch that essence that has no words, but we have to be allowing of the language to express it. So we know this threshold. We know where we are, and I was going to say, just don't have fear of the groundlessness, but there's a joy in it. It's like, like a freedom. And in the kind of what is this experience of that emptiness, of that essence of Dhamma? What is this essence that the Buddha was saying 2,000 years ago that has been touched through my body, through my thinking mind? And here I am trying to speak it, and I'm back to words. It's a very humbling thing, but very beautiful to join together at that place of, there. I just won't even say it, of that where the essence can be known, and somehow we share it. Somehow language allows us to say something about it. And there's patience. We don't have to say a lot here. A challenge of our practice has always been the challenge, I mentioned it earlier, where the momentum of the conceptual, of the intellectual, could still make this difficult to access. That's our challenge. There's nothing I can say other than, we enter the practice, we enter this essence phase, perhaps knowing that, and say, okay, my mind might still be very much in the language, culture, analysis, whatever, and just pause and place ourselves in that silent edge and do what we can. So that's where the patience and the kind of responsiveness together can be so supportive. So just to kind of sense into that one thing, I'll give us a very short exercise. I'm going to mention a Dhamma concept and just let you kind of launch into it Don't have to say anything about it now, but to just feel that a little bit, right? Okay, so we pause and we have the teachings on anatta, not self, and sunyata, emptiness, voidness. So just ponder that for a moment and feel how the word points you into the essence of the thing itself without words. Anatta, not self, and sunyata, voidness, emptiness. So this leads us to the last phase of Dharma contemplation, which is simply dialogue. And for those who have practiced insight dialogue, it's a very easy shorthand to say this phase is insight dialogue. But insight dialogue, rather than a new contemplation being offered, this whole, everything that preceded this phase is offering the contemplation. So you can set down the text, put it away, trust that it has found some kind of home in you. And now you meet with your co-practitioners, your spiritual friends, in this very life, in things as they actually are in this moment. When you pause, what's arising now in this, you've just been, let's say, contemplating a teaching like gratification, danger, and escape, or superiority and inferiority conceit, or some image of the pools filling and down to rivers and down to the sea, the way, the Dhamma is flowing, and now it's this. And what is known? What is emergent? What is the truth to be spoken? So we join each other in this, it's a place of spiritual friendship, ripening, and we listen deeply. So the text has touched us and we've put it aside, and we're now being touched by what's arising in the body, mind, and by what is spoken by our spiritual friends. So this now touches the moment. This is, you might say, the text of the moment, or the living experience of the Dhamma as it's coming through you and you and you and me. So in that sense, the experiential aspect of the dialogue phase, as far as I'm concerned, is just us being together now. And how is this, And of course, after our dialogue phase, we close with silence again. And rest in the silence. There's a kindness in that. Not pushing ourselves to go do or be something. So I think for our dialogue time together, I'd like to give us a chance to speak together about, the practice and so on. I will try to provide some links in what I say between Dharma contemplation and whole life path and insight dialogue as promised. But of course, you already have this one important piece, that the dialogue phase of Dharma contemplation is essentially insight dialogue. So that's very straightforward. But also to realize that Dharma contemplation specifically invites us into an examination and a deeper experience of language carrying Dhamma, language carrying the living experience, or triggering the living experience of Dhamma. And in that sense, it contributes to practices like insight dialogue, where we are using words, we are contemplating together this lived experience of suffering and the end of suffering. And perhaps we come to it with more discernment in relationship to how we speak, how we use language, and a sense perhaps of the text having carried something that now lives in us. And so we see that that's what insight dialogue is doing, is it's bringing the Dhamma alive in this relational practice. So spiritual companionship is alive in both practices, and listening deeply is alive in both practices. Being at the edge of language, that jumping that boundary back and forth between words and the wordless, is alive in Dharma contemplation and in insight dialogue. And embodying the Dhamma, sensing the living quality of the Buddha's teachings in the body, in the totality of the body-mind, is essential to both practices. And in relationship to the whole life path, practices like Dharma contemplation that bring the Dhamma closer into our hearts as a something alive, as something inspiring, something that touches us and challenges us. The more kinds of experiences we have like that, which also arise in silent meditation or private Dhamma study, or in other practices you do, those practices become part of us. And when we talk about living a whole life path, this is the source of the guidance. These experiences of, as directly as possible, a living wisdom. That's how we find the guidance in them. That's how, if we're going to be practicing right effort and we're at our jobs and someone says something untrue or unkind, and we're trying to figure out how to respond skillfully, then we draw on our experiences of all kinds, of all of our practices, including perhaps having touched something deep in the Dhamma through Dharma contemplation or insight dialogue. And now we have a sense of non-harm in our response. We have a sense of honesty. We feel a commitment to kindness as much as we're capable of it at that moment, and so on. So this is how the living experience is manifesting in how we behave and how we live. So this is the thing itself. This is not just a practice. This is life, where we impact people, where we are impacted by others. So knowledge helps. Knowledge isn't wisdom, but it helps. Knowledge becomes wisdom as we live it, as we enact it. And so this practice, we can hope, contributes to that. So I'll stop, this part of our being together and open the space. If perhaps you have experiences that you want to share or questions you want to ask, and maybe when we close, we can talk about next steps that might be of interest. So if you want to you could just raise your hand. I can see everybody on the screen. That's fine. And then you could unmute and speak. Yeah, Elizabeth. Be sure to unmute.
Thank you for these steps and explanations, because I'm new to this and I'm trying to grasp all of these teachings. I've been meditating for a long time, but this is giving me more guidance, the intention to follow with 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 the Buddha's teachings. I I think that um, I'm really touched by these steps, and I've been thinking a lot about how to love myself, which is in there, which also leads me to the friendship. Um, that's what I think is going to be so useful for me. And I'm really happy that you kind of leading today, and it's kind of open up for me new ways to do this
Mm,
and to kind of um, clear the path. Thank you.
mm, beautiful. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, uh, we have seen in several sessions that actually meaning, essence, and dialogue kind of come together or interconnect. Um, any suggestions, or we just let it be in that way, or yes.
I understand. And, um, the distinctions of the phases are artificial. It's not, there's nothing true about it. It's just intended to be useful. Um, So I would ask it as a question. Do you feel free, encouraged to go into the, shall we say, the stronger parts or the depths of, for example, the meaning phase? And if you do that, when you do that, does it allow you to also go into the depths of the essence phase? So there are places of overlap, and I think that's natural and helpful, like essential, not just helpful. It's like that's kind of where we live, is in those overlaps. But at the same time, I know for myself, in different moods or different kinds of texts or different teachings, the meaning aspect, the conceptual aspect, sometimes really calls me to be skeptical or to think about the culture or to think about the language in very, technical ways. And there are times, more times actually, where I just don't want anything to do with that. And I just want to just absorb something that is very delicate and refined, and like the words just barely help me get there. Right. And so all the places, on the whole map of how the body, mind, the heart functions are valuable and important, including, moving in the different ways. And that sometimes you may also want to explore and may find value in the very specific outer reaches of each phase. But I wouldn't call it right or wrong. It's more that it has a purpose. And I'm guessing, just knowing you as a human being, Lou, that the way that where you're doing the overlap is completely rich with truth, with experience, with Dhamma. Yeah. Yeah, Mike.
Hi, thank you very much for your discussion, Gregory. It was nice to hear this clarification of how you put this practice together. And I've appreciated how different it is from the more conventional sutta study practice that I'm still involved with. Where we tend to immediately go into what do these words mean, and what's the underlying philosophy of this sutta, and so on. And I found it useful what you said about chanting too, because it's been my experience when I've been on retreats at monasteries that having that chant, having something like the morning chanting in your mind, that coming up in my mind instead of some song or something, is really, really useful. So it's great. I say thank you for coming and visiting us. It's very nice to see you.
Yeah. There's a discourse where the Buddha is, I'm thinking of two different discourses. One where the Buddha is asked, why do we sometimes not remember the chants from long ago, the ancient chants? Why do we sometimes remember them and sometimes not? And he goes into quite a profound teaching on the purification of the mind. I mean, it's a really pretty intense teaching. But I couple that here with another teaching he gave on while one is studying the Dhamma is one instance, and then he unpacks that, while one is teaching the Dhamma, while one is reflecting on the Dhamma. Each of these is followed by the full thing I'm about to say. In all of these cases, the factor of awakening of mindfulness is present and comes to fulfillment and development in this person. So we get a sense of the mind kind of being absorbed in whether we're teaching or studying or being with spiritual friends and exploring or chanting. You know, the conditioning of the mind in a wholesome way as a bona fide meditation practice, the cultivation of the quality of sama, sati, and of not only right mindfulness, but the factor of awakening of mindfulness. Mindfulness as is working with all of the other factors like samadhi and investigation of states and energy and joy, rapture, equanimity, and so on, functioning here even as we engage with a text, holding the teachings in the heart. A couple of things that I wanted to touch on before we close, just practical things. Something I began with, I wanted to say again, and that is my respect for your meeting regularly, my deep appreciation to you, Lou, for, moving this along, and Venerable Vimala for the, kind of the support and the hosting. Very, quite meaningful to me. So I want to say that if there's any way that I can support both this group, but if any of you want to start other groups, that we could explore what might be needed to help develop as facilitators of the practice. Something that Lou has been, whether intuitively or by experience you have, I don't know, doing all along by having all different people facilitate. That's like perfect, just perfect. But if there's any other steps and that you want to then share this practice with groups in your home countries or in your town, I would love to support that. So please do contemplate that. Also, over the years, I have gathered a lot of text excerpts for this practice. And so at some point, we could put together a library of excerpts that could be arranged by topic and length and how much metaphor and how much sort of analytical thinking, because you know how the texts are in the canon. They have a range of qualities, you might say. So that would be also something that if there's people who want to participate in putting that together, I'd be happy to help with that. And maybe someday we want to think about a Dharma contemplation workbook. It could draw from the little book that I wrote on Dharma contemplation, but be much more oriented towards practice. So if anybody was inspired in that direction, I'm just dropping the seed. And if I could support that, I would be happy to do so. And before we would go ahead and decide to do any translating of the existing Dharma contemplation book, we'd want to think about whether that book suits the purpose. I'm not saying it doesn't. It's just been a long time since I visited it. And so that would be a collective investigation, not just something that I would just kind of do. So I wanted to put all of that out there. So last moment before we close with loving kindness, sharing of merit. Any other comments? Okay, good. Well, reflecting on our purpose today, we talked about letting the Dhamma come and live inside us. And of course, the purpose of that is, suffering and the end of suffering, to know it, to realize it in ourselves and for the benefit of others. So may everything that we have done here today serve all beings through how we behave and think, and through our actions in the world, and in ways that we can't possibly know. All beings who are suffering, may they be free of suffering. And may all beings, without exception, share in the merits of our practice. May there be peace. May there be peace. May there be peace.